Up, folks. First of all, though, I'd like to introduce Professor Brett Sutton, the Chief Health Officer of Victoria. Brett, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dr. Shane. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to have you on the line. I think most people know who you are, but give us a bit of a rundown. What's the role of the CHO, the Chief Health Officer, and how does it differentiate from the Chief Medical Officer role?
Yeah, it's a good question. The general impression, I guess, would be that the Chief Health Officer carries statutory powers under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act and can implement them in routine times as well as in under a pandemic declaration. That's certainly been the front and centre elements of my role in the last 2.5 years. But in normal times, whatever that means, it's really more expert advice on public health to government, as well as being a spokesperson on public health matters, especially for incidents and emergencies. So, you know, from a measles outbreak or a foodborne outbreak or a Legionnaire's disease outbreak linked to cooling towers, you know, I've either stood up occasionally as Deputy Chief Health Officer previously or as Chief Health Officer on those issues, but I wasn't in the role very long when the COVID-19 pandemic came along. So it's been the statutory powers that have been the real feature, but it is a broader role. It deals with all food safety, environmental health, communicable disease, as well as some other miscellaneous issues. And there's a parliamentary requirement for a biennial report on the state of health in Victoria as well, which I hope people can dig into and see that there really is a lot of work in the population health space that the department does, and which I try and highlight as well.
Yeah, interesting. I think one of the things that's fair to say is we haven't really seen a lot of that other work that you do up until this point, because the focus, whenever we see you in the media, is always seemingly on COVID. So I'm not sure, is the other work as high profile? I'm guessing most of the time that's sort of happening in the background.
Yeah, look, it's certainly happening in the background, but the pace and volume of that work has gone on unabated. I guess it's been constrained by the flex that we've all had to do to focus on COVID. But there's still a lot of policy making work, a lot of guidance, a lot of analysis that goes into the policy development that's happening all of the time. But I didn't have a significant profile, so I might have been on radio once a month or TV every now and again. But I didn't have 170,000 people who might have been able to reflect on my thoughts on Twitter previously. So some of that's an opportunity now, and I do hope to highlight broader public health issues going forward.
Yeah. Now let's go back a little bit. You're 12 years old. You're dreaming of being the CHO. Is that how it worked? What was it like when you were growing up? Did you always want to become the Chief Health Officer, or was this something that sort of popped up a little bit later?
Oh, it definitely came late in my life or in my career. I graduated from high school thinking I'd want to become a vet, but really switched very late in the piece to medicine, but didn't have super strong feelings about it at that time. But it really grew on me over time, and it was a combination of doing medicine and travelling internationally that really took my focus from individual clinical care to public health. And I did have 10 fantastic years in emergency medicine, including in northwest Tasmania and Victoria, as well as in the UK, and then some humanitarian work in Afghanistan and Horn of Africa. But there was more population health focused work in East Timor and Kenya, Ethiopia, that made me think about the power of population health. And so I did put my hand up for a job in the health department on my return to Australia from East Timor in 2010. And yeah, it dawned on me slowly that this role of Chief Health Officer was a really critical one in supporting population health, and had some great role models from John Carney and Rosemary Lester and many others. So a long tradition of people who are really focused on maximising the health and wellbeing of Victorians and in global work as well.
Do you find, Brett, that there are times where there's a bit of a balance you have to strike between the population level stuff and what feels like the more individual stuff?
Yeah, certainly the crisis management stuff always has urgency to it and takes centre stage. So you have to make sure that you're appropriately invested in that other really important work, that affects people every day, but across a population of millions and millions. And so, whether it's a slow burning crisis like antimicrobial resistance or one with an even longer latent period like climate change and its multitudinous effects on health and well-being, but also, overweight and obesity, sedentary behaviour, smoking, gambling, excessive alcohol intake, all of those things are deep up mental concerns. I don't always intersect with them fully as Chief Health Officer because there are other divisions in the department that manage that, but they're all something that we need the focus and the work on because they certainly play out in our health and well-being across the country.
Yeah. Now, we've had the idea, I suppose, that clean water is almost, do we call it a human right? I'm trying to think of exactly how we sort of address that worldwide, but I know the idea of everyone having access to clean water is a pretty fundamental idea that we have across the world now. You would have experienced a lot of that with your travels. I mean, this is something that we think of, as a core element of our health, yeah?
Absolutely. And I remember a statement by my Afghan translator back in 1997, and he said to me, you do realise that if you have a pet at home, it will drink cleaner water than our president drinks. And it really struck me, at a population level, there's still much of the world that struggles to access what we regard as a very fundamental entitlement and one that is invisible to us because we can always access it and it very, very rarely isn't available to us, with free access and at a very reasonable price.
So fast forward there, those conversations you've had now are in a situation where we're starting to talk about clean air as, something that we should all have access to. Where do you think we're at with that? And let's just talk pre-COVID, where we're looking at in the home, in the office, on public transport, the various settings that we find ourselves in. How are we going with regards to clean air standards before we actually, hit the pandemic?
There was clearly a focus on it and it was clearly understood to be important. Having gone through the Industrial Revolution, we saw how it played out in Europe in particular when there were huge issues of particulate matter and the great London smog that killed thousands and thousands of people. And so there was a focus on outdoor ambient air quality, and that's been an ongoing focus, and there are national standards and Victorian efforts in that regard that relate to emissions as well as various pollutants in the air that affect our health and well-being. Indoor air, with respect to infectious diseases, less so. It was certainly, it started to be incorporated in building standards, and it was definitely highlighted through an era when tuberculosis was a huge burden.
Yep.
But I guess it had been forgotten a little bit, and we didn't realise the necessity and the power of it with a very infectious disease really until COVID. I mean, we know it makes a difference with other infectious diseases, but how central it was and how important it is for kind of sustained well-being, I think we're only just coming to realise in recent months and years. Yeah.
With COVID, do you have a feel at this point for how much of the transmission is occurring due to, the aerosol nature of the virus versus contact? Because, if we go back a couple of years, we had a very strong focus on cleaning surfaces, on all the hand hygiene, all of those things. Do we have a feel for how much, transmission there is via that more traditional route compared to the aerosol nature of the virus we sort of accept now?
Well, I hope we're coming around to it. I think it's taken a while. It's not easy to get studies on this and to make appropriate comparisons. But, the CDC, for example, really nailed it when fomite or surface transmission was regarded as a 1 in 10,000 per exposure risk. And so it's really not nearly as great as we might have imagined previously. Of course, hand hygiene's been a central pillar public health for a long, long time, but more with bacteria, more in an era of poor sanitation. But it's been said in my team, and Dr. Seaman, who was on just before, said it. In fact, he said ventilation should be our hand washing in 2022.
Right.
That hand washing was in 2020. We really need to see that as our hygiene measure par excellence, because I think that's going to be more impactful by orders of magnitude compared to surface contacts.
Yeah, it's interesting, Brett. We had Robin Schofield on a couple of weeks back, who I know you're familiar with, and one of the first things she did was pop a CO2 monitoring device in the studio when she came in, and we were not overly surprised, but of course, concerned to see the CO2 levels more than doubling during the course of a 1 hour show in a relatively small room. And I thought, here at RRR, we open up the doors, we have HEPA filters, which, is not a way to remove CO2 in case anyone's wondering if that's the way to solve climate change. But it does strip out, the virus. And we're pretty careful to make sure that airflow is monitored and taken care of. But even so, those levels were drifting up. I mean, there must be circumstances where there's much worse, though, where we have large numbers of people and we're not currently dealing with ventilation in the way that's, effective.
Yeah, it's true. And we're learning more all of the time. But those key factors, the size of the room, the number of people inside, the activity they're undertaking, and obviously talking increases viral particle emissions if there's someone infected unknowingly, but also exertion. And I think we're increasingly understanding that it doesn't take too much, but it does need to be cross-room flow. Yep. And so opening a door, even for a relatively short period of time, it might be 10 minutes in an hour, but if you can get that through-room flow happening from door to window, window to window, it can make a huge difference. But yes, it doesn't take long to build up, but it also can be addressed pretty quickly with some additional simple measures, either that natural ventilation or a ceiling fan or a pedestal fan to help accelerate that natural ventilation. And obviously HEPA filters where you can't get sufficient natural ventilation. They won't change those CO2 levels, as you say, but they'll absolutely mop up viral particles.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things, of course, that's still out there en masse, it would seem, is this 1.5 metre kind of myth that I realise, it was interesting at the start of the pandemic when, people are sort of coughing and sneezing, and that idea of very large particles coming out of our bodies and hitting the ground within a metre or so. It seemed like a pretty good idea to send this piece of communication out that 1.5 metres would give you a degree of safety, or at least reduce your risk. That still seems to be everywhere. I mean, how do you see that, given we really need people to be thinking very differently now? I mean, one of the things I will tell people about the RRR studios is that we don't, like when I do my show, no one was in this studio for the hour beforehand, because even when there's no one in the room with a properly aerosol type virus, that can be hanging around in the air well past the point when they left. So is this 1.5 metre stuff now becoming problematic?
Look, I think it's clearly been of some benefit over a long period of time because 1.5 metres is better than 0.5 metres. There's no question. But it has obscured the fact that it's a gradient and not some kind of magical wall where the virus doesn't go any further. And I think that the droplet dogma held us back in that regard. But, the studies that show that people have been infected over 8, 10, 15 metres within an enclosed space, again, depending on activity and natural ventilation, has made us realise that 1.5 metres isn't some magical barrier. So, yes, still useful to create that distance if you can, but you shouldn't think, I'm at 2 metres, I don't need to wear a mask, I don't need to think about ventilation, because you do. And even though you can diminish that risk, there are more things that we can and should do, because transmission certainly occurs over that longer distance. And as you say, aerosolised particles stay suspended in the air for a significant amount of time. And so having ventilation all of the time helps to manage, that next person who comes in the room which is just as important.
Yeah, I think we often forget just how far some of this stuff travels, even outdoors. I think where we obviously are at much lower risk, there's still the potential for aerosol particles to travel substantial distances. I remember recently just walking down the street with my wife, and there was a couple of gentlemen on the other side of the street walking, in the opposite direction. They were smoking. And it wasn't long before we smelt the smoke on the other side of the road. And I thought, we're outside. There wasn't a lot of wind, but things disperse fairly quickly, and we forget just how much that can occur. And the virus happens to, disperse just as quickly as many other things like smoke and so forth. And we don't think about that. In terms of, what's being put in place, Brett, around the state, I mean, is there a strong push coming from you and the department to really up the ante with regards to ventilation? I mean, we have pretty extremes in weather here in Melbourne, like most cities do, where, if it's, I suppose, autumn or spring, it's kind of nice to open all the windows. But, in the middle of summer and middle of winter, it's far more challenging.
It's not an easy task, but there will be little things that we can do. And again, it won't be having doors wide open on a freezing cold day as your only means of ventilation. But if we can all think about the opportunity to get some ventilation in at intervals, even in cold weather, that's going to make a difference. But then to think about, and we've got those self-assessment tools available through the department's website, to see what other things that you might be able to do, including those ceiling and pedestal fans or the HEPA filters, if you've really got no other option. But also to, recognise that we're playing the long game here. There'll be some structural planning and policy issues to play out over years to come for COVID, but also for any other infectious disease, especially respiratory viruses that'll play out over winters especially, and flu's a case in point. That's why I think we need to keep at it. We've got a ventilation technical advisory panel. It's working across departments. So there's been a great deal of expertise inputted into that, and it's absolutely informing both policy as well as government rebates and government grants for small and medium-sized businesses to make those modifications or to get those assessments. And so I really hope that it scales up over time and that the awareness is enough that people make those small changes across all of these indoor settings that we're in all of the time, because, it's not just about today's numbers or the hospitalisation today. It'll be what's the frequency with which we get COVID over the next 2, 3, 4 years, and ventilation will play its role there. So it'll be a downward pressure on long COVID. It'll be a downward pressure on those post-COVID illnesses that are increase in frequency because you've had COVID, including clots, including heart attack, including respiratory illness. So, really important in the long game that we have a focus on ventilation. Absolutely, we're providing that advice to government.
Yeah. And Brett, the big one at the moment, of course, is the mask wearing. I mean, everyone seems to be talking about this, and I know there's some pushback from certain individuals on mandates, and I realise mandates can be challenging. What's your sort of view on this? I mean, I think, via your, quite prolific Twitter feed, I've noticed you've been pretty consistent with regards to this. It seems to me this is just another tool that we should be using as much as possible, and especially where there are vulnerable people in play that we want, we all need to protect. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we just need to continue that message. Of course, it's got a lot of heat in it from time to time, and it's been polarising in ways that it shouldn't have been. We should have all been able to sit back. Yes, we could have argued the points about exactly how effective a mandate might be, or exactly the magnitude of the impact of wearing masks at a population level, but none of us should have been fighting the fight over whether it makes a difference in terms of downward pressure on transmission, because it just does. Yep. And so that should be the starting point, and we should all reflect on the fact that even with low numbers, and we've got today's numbers lowest for the whole of this year, I think, we should still remember that nobody wants 20 deaths per day, and that downward pressure on transmission makes a difference in that regard. And so I really do hope we acculturate a bit more to saying it's just a mask. It's not going to do me harm. It can only do myself and others good. So I'll do it as often as I can, and recognising that it's not for everyone in every moment in time, but there are particular settings, again, with poorer ventilation, crowded spaces indoors where it should really be something that we go to by default.
Yeah. Do we need to do a lot more at the moment in the communication space? Because I think one of the things that I've noticed is there still tends to be a tremendous amount of what we would probably call mask theatre going on. We know that, the blue surgical masks are not really, where we want to be in terms of protection. And yet we still see those. We see those with clinicians. We see those with politicians. We see those with all sorts of people. There's still a lot of masks around chins. There's masks being carried. Is there a big communication piece that needs to be done here to sort of offset that negativity that's happening at the moment?
Yeah, I certainly think, again, it's a long game here. I certainly think we need to be able to sustain behaviours that are useful in the long term, but also not wear people down. You're right that we all become models in terms of how we wear it, and we create the social norms by what we do individually and collectively. But, the N95, KN95 announcement from the Victorian government was very much part of that communication campaign. So it's not just about making those masks available, but it's been really clear that we understand that we're dealing with a very transmissible virus and that a well-fitting mask, a higher grade mask, is even better protection, and that we regard it as a really central pillar of control and protection. So, that kind of communication, yes, we'll need to sustain that into the long term for sure.
Brett, before we let you go, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the health system and how it's faring at the moment. We hear a lot of stories, there's a lot of stuff in the news. I'm sure some of it's at the extreme end, but some of it may actually be right in the middle. How are we faring? I mean, you mentioned the hospital numbers are coming down with regards to COVID, but it seems as though there's an incredible degree of strain in the healthcare system at the moment.
Yeah, look, I think there is. Clearly, hospitalisations have come down by about a third, and the same for ICU in recent weeks. But I don't want to speak on behalf of clinicians. I haven't been in ED for some years now, and it was a tough enough gig on a normal day. I hate to think how wards and outpatients and ED are faring. I do think it's useful for everyone in the community to try and see it through healthcare workers' eyes, because it's not just about them facing today. It's the fact that it's 2.5 years in. We've had deferred care as well, and we've got people struggling for a whole bunch of reasons because of what we've been through. And there's no, pot of gold at the end of the line. We just need to do the hard yakka to be able to make it easier for them. I came back from the UK recently, and I have to say, COVID looks forgotten to me, and it's almost true for everyone except for those in the NHS who regard it as an absolute disaster. And so, I am grateful for the fact that we retain a focus on COVID, even if people are tiring of it, because it's absolutely a threat to our health system and how we can all access it.
Yeah. And Brett, in terms of the coming sort of year, I think it's fair to say that, we will expect there'll be further waves. There's no reason to expect they'll be easier or better. That often is thrown around, and I don't think that expectation is sound, and certainly based on our experience over the last 2 years hasn't panned out. Are you hopeful, and what do you think that we need to sort of be doing over the next 6 months, given that we're not out of this and we won't be out of this for a while?
Yeah, I think we have to prepare for wave after wave. Unfortunately, it's an uncomfortable reality, but it's absolutely how it's going to be. I hope that there's a game-changing vaccine, intranasal vaccine, pan-coronavirus vaccine that's properly able to block transmission altogether and works across all variants. But that is not just around the corner. It might be 2-3 years away, and so. It's going to be a continued bumpy ride, but it's a case of, shoulder to the ground to be able to continue to manage it. The severity of particular variants of concern, we shouldn't make the call that there's something intrinsic about the virus that it just gets less severe over time. We've seen it go up and down and up and down, and that can absolutely be how it proceeds from now on. We can certainly make it better by having higher third and fourth dose vax coverage. Third dose is good, not brilliant. Fourth dose, we're at about 62% for those 65 and above, so we can do better there. That's an extra wall of immunity that we need. And, of course, a lot of us have been infected. That does provide some additional immunity. We don't want it as our strategy, and we certainly don't want to say get infected to avoid infection, but we can recognise that it will provide some shorter-term downward pressure. That's why we're on the downslope now, in part. So, we're going to have these rides because of that combination of things, but there are still plenty of things we can do to help ourselves and those around us.
Yeah. Brett, in all your years doing this sort of work, have you ever seen a virus that seems to be so different for different people before?
I guess there are a number that we don't necessarily focus on. That there are some that are devastating for young children and asymptomatic for the great majority of the population, and vice versa. So I wouldn't say it's the strangest in that regard, but it's as a pandemic, it's very different from an influenza virus, isn't it? It may be that the so-called pandemic of the late 1800s, 1880s or 90s was a coronavirus pandemic. We never knew it, but that was one that lasted 3 to 5 years in terms of its disruptions. So there might be history there, but we certainly have short memories sometimes when it comes to pandemic responses.
Yeah. Well, Professor Brett Sutton, thanks so much for being our guest today on Einstein and Go-Go. It's great chatting to you. Hopefully we'll get to do it again at some stage when, I don't know, maybe after the next wave, or when the next wave is not happening, or whatever else the future brings. But thanks for all the work that you do. We do appreciate it. We know it's a tough gig, and you probably cop a lot more flack than you should, but it is appreciated that you put in the hard yards and communicate in a way that I think we can all appreciate. So thanks very much for being a guest today.
Thanks, Shane. It's been a pleasure.
Folks, we're going to take a break for some music.